we start with a script. Every film starts with a script. Alfred Hitchcock, the great maker of thrillers back in the 1950s and 60s, said something like this: to make a great film, you need three things: the script, and the script. In other words, you can have all the most amazing acting, the most amazing special effects, the most beautiful costumes, gorgeous scenery, excellent cinematography. But if the story itself, if the script that the movie is telling is not of high quality, the movie itself is very likely not going to be of high quality either. So, and we've all seen those movies where the script is meh, it's okay, but some really great actors and maybe some really great directing at least elevate the script to a point where it's a passable movie. It's all right, it's good, it's all right. Sometimes we've seen really great directors and really great actors and really great cinematographers and costumers take a horrible script and elevate it, and then sometimes we've seen really great scripts in the hands of maybe not the best directors, and they suffer for that. So what you really want ideally is a really great script married to a really great director, really great acting team, really great cinematographer, costumers, makeup folks, tape gaffers, lighting, cinematography, all of that. The story is, let's say My Day. We're going to make a movie of My Day, which would not be a great, exciting film. But a movie, a story is all the things that happen, from me standing up to brushing my teeth to putting on my clothes to eating my grape nuts to getting in my car, driving to work, logging into my computer, checking my email, all the minutia of a day. That's the actual story. In a screenplay, you have the plot. Those are the things that the story needs to actually move the plot forward, to make the story happen on screen for you. One of my professors back in grad school called this like he had two metaphors for it. One was the dominoes, where you line up the dominoes and then you flick one and it hits a domino and they fall and they fall and they fall and they fall. So a plot could be the dominoes, or it can also be the trigger effect, where you shoot your gun, bullet comes out, something happens, boom. So that's the plot. It's the events that happen that keep the story moving forward. In a good screenplay, your writer is going to know what events need to happen to keep the plot moving forward. There's not going to be extra ones usually, because that's a very expensive waste of time. And then hopefully there's not going to be gaps and holes either. So the story order. A story order is strictly chronological. A to B to C to D, all the way to Z. It's linear. It's a story that follows a straight line. It's the dominoes. That's a story order. Plot order can be nonlinear. Plot order could be flashbacks, or things like we jump ahead or we skip back. Other ways that we can tell a story that are not just in a straight line. That can be plot order. So you've got 3-act structure. This actually dates all the way back. We're going back into ancient Greece now, when we were first writing dramas to be performed on a stage. But essentially, your film or your play, or even a book, is divided into 3 basic acts. In Act 1, you meet the characters, you meet the setting, you are introduced to whatever the primary problem of the film is going to be. That's your Act 1. It's typically about 30 pages of the screenplay. Then you've got Act 2. This is where you see your characters dealing with the problem, and hopefully a little bit of an escalating tension, right? So they solve a problem or do an obstacle, they meet someone, something's happening as the plot just accelerates and builds. That's your Act 2, and that's usually about 60 pages of your screenplay. And then Act 3 happens when you have the big climax, the moment that the film has been developing towards, the moment when we see, aha, that is how this story is going to end. boom, that's your climax. And from there, you have Act 3, and that's typically about 30 pages of your screenplay. So typically a screenplay is maybe about 120 pages. It's bookended, Act 1, Act 3, 30 pages each, Act 2 in the middle, 60 pages. That's typical. Of course, it's not a hard and fast rule, just kind of a norm. So in Act 1 of Sherlock Jr., we see the setting, which was at that time a contemporary movie theater. Remember, this movie was made contemporary as it is. It looks old-fashioned to us, but to the people that made it, it was very new. So in Act 1, we met our main character, which was our film operator, who wanted to be a private detective. So he read about Sherlock Holmes, and we meet the young lady on whom he has a crush. So we meet them in Act 1. And then the problem is that our projectionist wants to date and marry the girl, but he's poor, and she thinks he stole her father's watch. So there's our problem, right? So when you see Buster Keaton, he's in the film, he's in the theater, he's sweeping, he's cleaning up the trash, he does some really great bits with some dollar bills, right? And some paper that sticks to him, some really fun bits. He's just building up and letting you get to know his character. He's fumbling, he's awkward, he's not suave and debonair. So that's your Act 1. Then so our obstacle though, the moment where we transition is the moment where the watch is stolen by our villain, our dastardly tall villain. Act 2 then, we have kind of two stories going on. In real life, the projectionist, our Buster Keaton character, he wants to solve the mystery of the watch, right? So that's the real life problem that's happening. Then there's his fantasy thing, his dream that happens when he falls asleep, and the story that's acted out like a movie, which includes all of these wonderful stunts, the motorcycle, riding on the motorcycle handlebars, the falling on the water tank. He actually broke his neck in the creation of that stunt. For real, he really did break his neck. He did not realize he had broken his neck for several years. He had a constant chronic pain in his neck, and finally, years later, had an x-ray done, and they discovered that he had been living with a fracture in his neck from creating that amazing stunt. Also, he jumps through the window, comes out fully clothed, he shoots a pool game. All of these things happen in that dream life. So you've kind of got two Act 2s happening concurrently. Then we have Act 3, in which the mystery is solved. He wakes up. The girl he loves has also solved the mystery in real life. He puts the ring on her finger, and then he uses the movie to help him understand how to give the girl a kiss. And we have a happy ending. 3-act structure. You also have a very common trope called the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, author and philosopher, created not the concept of it, but he sort of put a modern word, a modern verbiage around it so that we could begin to understand it. It's a circle. The thing that's important to remember about the hero's journey is that it begins, it journeys, and then it ends in the same place. The Wizard of Oz is a really great example of a hero's journey. Yes, Dorothy is a girl. Hero doesn't have to be male specific. That can also be a female journey. But she starts in her ordinary world of Kansas. She has a call to adventure, which is actually, surprisingly, her call to adventure is the scene with the witch and the bicycle and Toto and all of that. She meets her mentor, which is the man who has the gypsy wagon fortune teller, right? And he advises her to go back home. She crosses the threshold at the moment of the tornado when the house is swept away. She has tests, allies, and enemies that she meets in Oz. She has the lion, the scarecrow, the Tin Man, Glinda. Those are her allies. She has tests like the poppy fields, and she has enemies like the Wicked Witch of the West and her monkeys. She's going to approach the witch's castle. She's going to have her ordeal, which happens in the witch's castle, and a rebirth. She seizes the sword, which in Wizard of Oz is actually a broom, and she has her road back to see the wizard, and she heads back to Kansas with all of this knowledge that her home is actually a place that she should love. So the Wizard of Oz is a perfect model of a hero's journey. So is Finding Nemo. You can actually put Finding Nemo with this. Actually, just about any superhero movie also fits this journey. Star Wars fits it beautifully. The Lord of the Rings is a perfect example of a hero's journey. When you begin to know what a hero's journey film is or book, you will begin to see it everywhere. The hero's journey is absolutely everywhere throughout Western literature. So a screenplay is the script, it's the words that the actors are going to say, but it is also the shooting directions that are included in the script so that the camera operators understand what the screenwriter intended for the audience to see in specific moments of dialogue. So what makes a screenplay really work, what makes it magical, is a well-crafted plot matched with really well-written dialogue and then delivered by really fantastic actors. For example, The Godfather, brilliant plot, fantastic dialogue, and absolutely impeccable acting. And The Godfather did win the Academy Award for Best Screenplay. In screenplays, you have original versus adapted. An original screenplay is something that is completely new. The screenwriter has written it from scratch on his or her own without looking at another piece of work. Django Unchained, 2012, completely conceived and written by Tarantino. Then you have your adapted screenplay, which is taken from a previously published source, usually a book, a story, or play, and then recrafted into a film format. For example, Lord of the Rings, which was adapted by Walsh and Boyens and Jackson starting in 2003? 1, 2, 3? I think they won the Oscar in 2003. So original versus adapted. When they do awards, during the awards season for this, they divide that up into 2 different awards. Okay, so next is genre. Now you're probably familiar with genre from high school English class. Genre is basically the organizing principle that refers to a kind or type of work. In film genre, we're kind of looking at here's the big ones. Science fiction, romantic comedy, action, documentary, biopic, animation, anime, Western, horror. Those are all examples of genre in film. The idea of genre actually traces back to Aristotle. Back in 335 BC, Aristotle wrote a work called Poetics. Poetics doesn't mean it's poetry like rhyming. That's not what he's talking about. In ancient Greek verbiage, poetics would just mean literature. And in Poetics, Aristotle laid out some definitions and some guidelines for how literature would work moving forward. He established these guidelines for the Greeks, which are to us the ancient Greeks, and then because Western civilization is such a strong influence on really everything that followed in Europe and then into America, we still use what Aristotle established. Aristotle defined a tragedy as a story in which your hero invokes pity and fear. That is tragedy. So think Hamlet, Shakespeare, Hamlet. Think Romeo and Juliet. Tragedies, lots of death, lots of sorrow, lots of fear in a tragedy. Comedy is typically going to have a happy ending, might or might not have laughs in an Aristotle type sense. It doesn't necessarily have to mean jokes, but it does mean that your characters are living on a lighter side of things and probably not so much death at the end. Genre has a social function. It works in our society. It offers us a narrative frame that we can use to watch and discuss and comment on the films that we see. Genre helps us understand ourselves. These stories tell us stories about ourselves. For example, Carrie. If you haven't seen Carrie, I would really suggest you see Carrie. It's a fantastic film based on a Stephen King novel. And we have a poor, bullied high school girl. She's different. They bully her terribly, and at the end, she has her revenge. I think people connect with Carrie because either you've been the girl who's been bullied, you've been the one doing the bullying, or you've been the person standing off to the side feeling helpless to do anything to fix the situation. But all of us are familiar with the concept of bullying, and when we see Carrie, it kind of gives us a chance to live vicariously through that story. So, elements of romantic comedy. We're going to get into some of the genres here. A romantic comedy has a contrived meeting. It has a meet cute, something that happens where they bump into each other or they send each other emails by mistake. Usually in a romantic comedy, they are polar opposites. Maybe one is super organized and one is a total mess. Something happens where they are opposite of each other, and that opposition provides a lot of opportunity for some conflict. There's an ordinary problem usually in the movie. It's not anything earth-shattering, something ordinary, something the audience easily understands, like maybe you get a new boyfriend, you're finding a job, you're starting a business, you're passing a test, something kind of like that. There's typically a sidekick for each of our main characters in a romantic comedy, and a happy ending. Romantic comedies must have a happy ending. A true to the genre romantic comedy is going to have a happy ending. Okay, then elements of Western. So these are going to be set in the American West, typically in the 1800s. You've got vast landscapes. Remember, we're in California. Filmmaking to California, partly so that we had these deserts, we had these mountains and these beautiful vistas where we could film big wide shots of sky. We've got a traditional hero who's typically a cowboy. Then you've got villains, always villains, either criminal gangs like bank robbers or Native Americans. The films that were made back in the 50s and 60s had a lot more Native Americans as villains. We're unfortunately seeing less of that as we become more aware and sensitive to the Native American story. But back in the 50s and 60s, not so much. So a lot of bad Indians back then. Women are stereotyped in a Western. Usually they are there to be pretty, or they are there for sexual relief, and they are there to civilize these rough men. That's what the function of a woman is typically in a Western. The themes in a Western are very clear: black and white, good versus evil. And things that you will see in a Western are guns, camera shots of holsters. You will almost always have some sort of a camera standing behind the cowboy, right at the level of his hand and his holster, as we see his hand hover above his holster to wait for the quick draw. Hanging ropes, lots of hanging ropes and people getting hung in a Western. Horses, of course, saloons, and dust. It's a dusty, dry desert place. Okay, so then you have your science fiction, which happens to be my husband's favorite genre, or one of them. So I tell a story, but I did not love science fiction when I was a younger person, and then I married someone who does. And so I have become a science fiction lover by osmosis. His favorite, by the way, is the Star Trek series. I know for some of you it is the Star Wars series, but at our house we do more Star Trek. All right, so elements of science fiction. It incorporates hypothetical science-based themes into the plots of the film. Futuristic elements and technologies are going to be a part of sci-fi typically. I think the best sci-fi uses technology and uses space as a metaphor to explore political and philosophical issues that are happening in real life. These are usually set in the future. They can be on Earth, but they can also be on space. In some ways, a sci-fi is similar to a Western in that there's also usually the hero and the villain. There's unexplored locations, fantastical quests, and advanced technology. So one of the things I love about watching, for example, Star Trek, is back when when Star Trek first came on, there were a couple of things that Picard would do that I thought at that time they just blew my mind. One was what is essentially in 2001 era flip phone, and they would have what looked like a flip phone, and they'd poof, flop, and it open, and they'd talk to each other that way. Like the communicator looked like a Nokia from 2002. And then the Kindle, actually. I remember seeing Picard read a book on what basically looked like a contemporary Kindle, and I just looked at it and thought, that can't happen, that will never happen, how can that possibly be? And of course now I carry my own with me everywhere I go. Okay, elements of horror, which is one of my favorite genres. You have a disturbing atmosphere, lots of framed scenes of darkness and restlessness, mysterious and disturbing objects. Creepy sound. Creepy sound is a really great layer that happens in a really good horror film. The disturbing sounds evoke an emotion from you because of not only what you're seeing, but also what you're hearing. There's typically going to be violence in a horror film. It could be produced by people within the narrative, like the Chainsaw Massacre, or it could be produced by monsters, like Alien, or it could be produced by supernatural beings, like Annabelle, which is a ghost or demon in adult. Fantasy films. They incorporate imaginative and fantastic themes. These themes usually involve magic, supernatural events, or fantasy worlds, like Jim Henson's Labyrinth or Lord of the Rings. Although it is its own distinct genre, fantasy can overlap over into horror and science fiction. Unlike science fiction, a fantasy film is not going to need to be rooted in fact. There has to be no scientific base upon which you build a world in fantasy like you do in sci-fi. This element allows the audience to be transported into a new and unique world. Often these films center on an ordinary hero in an extraordinary situation. A lot of fantasy films are hero's journey films. All right, so that's a look at scripts, at story, at genre, and you have a selection of films to look at. You may choose your genre this week. You have a film for several genres. Pick your poison. And we will see you next time for a study of mise en scene, which is the look of a film. Bye.